It was a crisp autumn morning when I first realized that the neighborhood I had chosen for peace and quiet was anything but peaceful. The sun was just beginning to climb over the tree line, washing the rows of neatly manicured houses in golden light. From the outside, everything looked perfect: white picket fences, freshly trimmed lawns, American flags waving gently in the breeze. The kind of suburb you might see on the cover of a real estate magazine. But behind that facade of order and tranquility was a web of control, fear, and pettiness carefully spun by one man, Charles Whitman, the president of our Homeowners Association. I had moved into this community only 2 years prior, after retiring from my position on the federal bench in the Capitol. To most of my neighbors, I was just Mark Reynolds, a widower in his early 60s looking for a quieter life. They didn't know about the courtroom battles I'd presided over, or the countless hours I had spent weighing evidence and issuing rulings that shaped lives. I didn't volunteer that information either. My wife, Claire, had passed away 3 years before, and after decades of high-pressure service, I wanted nothing more than to find some peace in her memory. I thought this little cul-de-sac would be the perfect place, but I underestimated Charles. From the moment I arrived, I could feel the man's shadow looming. He wasn't the kind of HOA president who quietly ensured the trash pickup was on time or that the community pool stayed clean. No, Charles saw himself as a king. He relished enforcing rules, no matter how small or absurd. Grass half an inch too tall? That would be a violation and a $50 fine. A garden gnome on your porch? That was clutter and grounds for a written warning. He would march the sidewalks with his clipboard, snapping photos of the slightest infraction, his face tight with self-importance. At first, I paid him little mind. I've spent too many years dealing with men drunk on authority to be rattled by one more. But I could see the effect he had on the neighbors. Mrs. Patel, a kind widow who lived 2 doors down, was fined hundreds because her rose bushes grew an inch over the regulation height. She would stand on her lawn, pruning them nervously while Charles watched from the sidewalk like a hawk. A young family across the street was cited for having their children's bicycles left near the driveway. I saw the father quietly wheel them into the garage, his jaw clenched, trying not to make a scene. Charles thrived on this fear. He fed on it. My first direct run-in with him came in the spring, not long after I had settled in. Claire had loved roses, and though she was gone, I kept a small garden in her memory. That year, I planted a row of climbing roses along my fence, their delicate buds just starting to bloom. One morning, I found a bright orange notice taped to my door. Violation: unauthorized planting. I chuckled at first, thinking it must be some mistake. Unauthorized planting? These were flowers, for God's sake. But when I called the number listed, Charles himself answered. His tone was clipped, authoritative. Your roses are not in compliance with HOA regulations. All plantings must be pre-approved. Failure to remove them will result in escalating fines. I remember the way he paused, as if daring me to argue. I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I said calmly, I'll look into it. But that was the moment I realized the game Charles was playing. These weren't rules designed to keep the neighborhood orderly. They were tools of control wielded at his whim. Over the next few months, I watched carefully. I noted the way Charles treated different people. Some he favored. His friends never seemed to get notices, even when their trash bins sat out for days. Others, like Mrs. Patel or the young family, were targeted relentlessly. And slowly, I began piecing together the truth. Charles wasn't just enforcing rules. He was using them to consolidate power. One humid evening, as the cicadas droned in the trees, Greg Thompson, my neighbor from across the street, stopped by. Greg was a retired veteran, a man of discipline and integrity. He leaned on my porch rail, his face troubled. "Mark," he said, "I hear Charles has been on your case about those roses." I nodded. Greg sighed. "You're not the only one. He fined me last month because my truck was parked in the driveway overnight. I told him I use it for work, that it doesn't even fit in the garage, but he didn't care. Said it made the neighborhood look unprofessional. I've lived here 10 years, never had a problem until he took over. As we talked, Mrs. Patel walked by, clutching a small basket of cut roses. She stopped, hesitated, then whispered, "Be careful. Charles doesn't like being challenged. He made my life miserable after I complained. Raised my dues, sent me threatening letters. I can't afford to fight him." Her words settled heavily between us. That night, I sat alone on my porch, staring at the roses swaying in the moonlight. For months, I had kept my head down, not wanting trouble. But I had sworn an oath once to uphold justice, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Retired or not, that part of me still lived. Charles thought he was untouchable. He thought no one would dare stand against him. He was about to learn he was wrong. The next morning, I began keeping records. Every notice, every letter, every word Charles uttered in our brief exchanges, I documented it all. I photographed Mrs. Patel's roses, perfectly trimmed to show there was no real violation. I took notes when Greg told me about his truck fine. Little by little, a picture began to emerge. A pattern of harassment. A pattern of abuse. Charles noticed, of course. He always noticed. One afternoon, I was in my yard trimming the roses when he strutted down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. He stopped at my fence, his eyes narrow. "Still haven't removed those, I see," he said. I looked up from my shears and met his gaze evenly. "They're roses, Charles. They're not hurting anyone. The rules are the rules," he snapped. "Or perhaps," I said quietly, "they're whatever you decide they are." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Just a flicker, quickly masked by arrogance. "Careful, Reynolds," he said, scribbling on his clipboard. "You're new here. You don't want to make enemies." He walked away, but the message was clear. That night, I spread the papers across my dining table, the evidence of his tyranny growing by the day. I thought of Claire, of how she used to tell me that bullies only win when good people stay silent. My heart ached for her steady wisdom, her laughter that once filled these quiet rooms. I imagined her voice urging me onward. I knew then what I had to do. The man who thought he could seize my home, who thought he could seize this entire neighborhood, was about to face something he never expected. Not just resistance, not just defiance, but the full force of truth. And I, Mark Reynolds, was ready to deliver it. The summer months brought no relief, only heat that clung to the air like a suffocating blanket. And with it came the next stage of Charles Whitman's campaign. If the spring had been a warning, summer was a declaration of war. It started with a letter. Bold red letters screamed from the envelope. "Final notice." Inside, a list of so-called violations tumbled across the page like accusations in a courtroom indictment. Unauthorized planting, $100 fine. Lawn not trimmed to regulation length, $75 fine. Failure to comply with HOA landscaping standards, $150 fine. I stood in my kitchen, the letter trembling slightly in my hand, though not from fear. No, it was anger, righteous and controlled. I had trimmed my lawn 2 days before. I kept it neat as a soldier's haircut. His claims were fabricated. Later that evening, I found Greg pacing on his driveway. "He find you too?" I asked. Greg's laugh was bitter. "This week? For my flagpole. Said it was too tall. I served this country, Reynolds. That flagpole's been there since the day I moved in. Now suddenly it's a violation?" I looked down the street. Charles' house sat smugly at the corner, larger than most, with a freshly paved driveway and shutters painted an approved shade of beige. His car gleamed in the sun, a symbol of his unchallenged reign. The neighbors had started avoiding him. I noticed curtains twitching when he walked by, parents pulling their children inside, conversations hushed when his figure appeared at the end of the block. Fear was his weapon, and silence his victory. But I would not be silent. I bought a thick binder and labeled it simply, Evidence. Into it went every notice, every letter, every time-stamped photograph of my perfectly trimmed lawn and carefully tended roses. Into it went affidavits, quietly gathered from neighbors who were too afraid to confront Charles directly but eager to share their stories in confidence. Mrs. Patel, her hands shaking, signed a statement about her endless fines. Greg gave me copies of his own violation letters. Even young Sarah, the teenager down the street, whose parents had been threatened for hosting a graduation party, slipped me a note describing how Charles had yelled at her for chalk art on the sidewalk. Piece by piece, the case grew. One sweltering afternoon, Charles made his move in person. I was seated on the porch, sipping iced tea, when he marched up the path, clipboard clutched like a judge's gavel. His smile was thin, rehearsed. "Mr. Reynolds," he said smoothly, "we've given you ample opportunity to comply. These continued violations are unacceptable. Unless you remove those roses and pay your outstanding fines, the association will have no choice but to begin proceedings to place a lien on your property." His words echoed like a gunshot. A lien, the ultimate weapon of the HOA. The power to threaten someone's very home, to dangle it above them like a hostage. I leaned back, keeping my voice calm. "A lien requires justification, Charles. Actual, documented justification," he sneered. "The board has all the justification it needs. And I assure you, they'll vote unanimously." "I wonder," I said, my eyes never leaving his, "if the board realizes what kind of liability they're exposing themselves to." For the briefest moment, I saw it again, that flicker of unease. But he covered it with bluster, tapping his clipboard. "You'll regret pushing this, Reynolds. People who fight the association never win." I smiled faintly. "We'll see." When he stormed off, I exhaled slowly, my mind already turning. He had shown his hand. He wanted my home. Not just control, possession. And if he could seize mine, he could seize anyone's. That night, the neighborhood gathered quietly in Greg's garage. Folding chairs were pulled into a circle, a single bulb swinging overhead, casting shadows on faces etched with worry. There were 10 of us, families, widows, young couples, all tired of living under Charles' thumb. Mrs. Patel spoke first, her voice breaking. "He threatened me last week. Said if I didn't stop complaining, he'd raise my dues again. I don't know how much longer I can afford this." A young father named Jason clenched his fists. "He fined us for our kid's swing set. Said it wasn't aesthetic." My wife cried for days. "We bought this house so our kids could have a yard. Now we feel like prisoners." I listened carefully, nodding, taking notes. When they finished, I closed the binder with a decisive snap. "You've all been bullied, harassed, extorted. He's counting on your fear. But Charles has made a critical mistake. He thinks no one here knows how to fight back." The room fell silent. I let the pause stretch, then continued. "What none of you know is that I served as a federal judge for over 20 years. I've presided over fraud cases, racketeering, civil rights abuses. And I can tell you with certainty, what Charles is doing is unlawful." Gasps rippled through the garage. Greg's eyes widened, then a grin tugged at his lips. "Well, I'll be damned." I held up the binder. "I've been collecting evidence, enough to expose him for what he is. But I'll need your help. More statements, more documentation. If we stand together, we can stop him." Hope flickered across their faces, fragile but growing. Over the following weeks, we worked in secret. Neighbors who once kept their blinds shut now slipped papers under my door, copies of letters, photographs, recordings. I built a timeline, meticulous and undeniable, showing how Charles had abused his position for personal gain. He wasn't just enforcing rules, he was selectively targeting those who opposed him while granting favors to allies. Even worse, I uncovered financial discrepancies in the HOA's budget, funds unaccounted for, payments routed suspiciously. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just petty tyranny. This was corruption. Charles must have sensed the shift, because his tactics grew more desperate. He sent me letter after letter, escalating fines into the thousands. He stood on the sidewalk during the day, glaring at my house like a sentinel. One evening, I returned home to find a bright orange sign staked in my yard. "Property in violation subject to lien." Neighbors peeked from their windows, whispering. To them, it looked like Charles had won again. But I only smiled as I tore the sign from the ground. The trap was nearly ready. One final piece remained: the board meeting. Charles had called for it himself, no doubt expecting to humiliate me publicly, to parade me as an example of what happens when you resist. He sent the notice with relish. Mandatory hearing on continued violations, attendance required. I circled the date on my calendar. The night of the meeting, the community center buzzed with low voices. Residents filled the chairs, tension hanging heavy in the air. Charles sat at the head of the table, flanked by board members who shifted nervously, their eyes darting toward him. His smile was confident, predatory. When my name was called, I rose slowly, binder in hand. All eyes followed me as I approached the table. Charles leaned back in his chair, smirking, certain of his victory. "Mr. Reynolds," he began, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "you stand accused of multiple, repeated violations of HOA regulations. This board will hear the evidence and decide appropriate penalties, including the possibility of a lien on your property." I set the binder on the table with a deliberate thud. Then I looked him dead in the eye. "Then let's talk about evidence." The room hushed. I opened the binder, pages neatly organized, each tab a dagger aimed at the heart of his empire. Photos, letters, statements, financial discrepancies. I laid them out one by one, my voice steady, measured like I had done 1,000 times in the courtroom. "This is a record of harassment," I said, my words cutting through the silence. "Selective enforcement of rules, targeted intimidation, abuse of authority. And this," I tapped the financial records, "the smoking gun. This suggests misappropriation of funds. Theft, plain and simple." Gasps echoed through the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Charles' smirk faltered. I straightened. "And before you dismiss this, know that I am fully prepared to take this matter to civil court. I served as a federal judge for over 2 decades. I know the law. I know the process. And I assure you, if these practices continue, not only will this HOA be dismantled, but criminal charges will follow." The color drained from Charles' face. He opened his mouth, stammering, but no words came. For the first time, the predator looked cornered. And in that moment, the power shifted. The silence in the community center stretched like a taut rope. Dozens of eyes shifted from me to Charles, waiting to see what would happen next. The once unshakable president of the HOA sat frozen, his mouth half open, his face pale beneath the harsh, fluorescent lights. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then whispers began to ripple through the room, neighbors leaning toward one another, voices hushed but urgent. "Did he just say he's a judge? Federal judge? Is that true? My God, Charles, what has he been hiding from us?" Charles slammed his palm on the table, the sound cracking like a whip. "Enough!" he barked, his voice louder than necessary, desperate. "This man is lying. He's fabricating evidence, manipulating you all. He's nothing but a disgruntled resident trying to undermine the association." I didn't flinch. I simply reached into the binder again, pulling free a printed transcript, my own judicial profile, publicly available, stamped with the seal of the United States courts. I laid it on the table before the board. "I am Judge Mark Reynolds, retired from the federal bench," I said, my voice low, deliberate, each word hitting like a gavel strike. "And I assure you nothing here is fabricated. Every document, every statement, every number has been verified, sourced, and can be authenticated in court." One of the board members, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, picked up the transcript with trembling hands. He scanned the page, his eyes widening as the truth set in. It's real," he muttered, almost to himself. The room erupted. Neighbors gasped, some clapping hands over their mouths, others exchanging wide-eyed looks. For years, Charles had strutted through the neighborhood unchecked, wielding power like a tyrant. And now, with a few sheets of paper, the illusion of invincibility shattered. Charles leaned forward, his face twisted with fury. "You think your title scares me?" he hissed. "This is my association. These people answer to me. You can wave around your binder all night, but when it comes down to it, the board votes with me." I tilted my head slightly, almost pitying. Not tonight, they won't. I reached into the binder one last time and withdrew a manila folder. Slowly, I opened it and spread the contents across the table. Bank statements, transaction records, names and dates highlighted in bright yellow. This, I said, tapping the pages, is evidence of embezzlement. Funds collected from residents' dues, money that should have gone to community improvements, diverted into personal accounts linked to you, Charles. Thousands of dollars over several years. The board members stiffened, eyes widening as they scanned the damning numbers. One woman, her lips pressed thin, turned sharply toward Charles. "Is this true?" she demanded. Charles sputtered, color flooding back to his face in blotches of red. "Lies. Forged documents. He's tricking you," but his voice cracked under the weight of panic. He was unraveling, and everyone could see it. I leaned closer, my gaze never leaving his. These documents were obtained legally through contacts in the financial sector. They've been cross-verified. You can deny it here, but in court, denial won't save you. Perjury won't save you. Theft won't save you. The neighbors' whispers turned to anger now, outrage buzzing like a hornet's nest disturbed. Greg, sitting in the back, stood abruptly. "So that's where our dues went? Not to fix the playground? Not to repair the pool? You pocketed our money while threatening to take our homes?" Others joined in. Mrs. Patel's voice trembled, but it was loud enough to carry. "You monster. I skipped my medication some months just to pay those fines you gave me. And you used it to fatten your pockets?" The dam had broken. Shouts rose, a chorus of fury, years of fear boiling into rage. For once, Charles wasn't in control. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, and then, one by one, they began to speak. "I never approved this," said the man with glasses, shaking his head. "If this is true, Charles, you've betrayed us all." The woman beside him stood. "I motion that we suspend Charles Whitman from his role as HOA president effective immediately pending investigation." "I second," another said quickly. Charles leapt to his feet, the chair screeching backward. "You can't do this," he shouted, spit flying. "I built this neighborhood. Without me, you'd all be nothing but lawless freeloaders. I own this association." "No, Charles," I said calmly, my voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "You never owned it. You only terrorized it. And tonight, that ends." Two neighbors stepped forward, blocking his path when he tried to storm out. He shoved at them, but they held firm. Others gathered close, a wall of defiance that he could no longer break. I placed the last piece of paper on the table, a formal complaint, already drafted, addressed to the county court. "I will be filing this in the morning," I announced. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of power. Every shred of evidence is here. You will face justice, Charles, not from me, but from the system you thought you were above. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for allies, but none came. The board sat stone-faced. The neighbors glared with newfound strength. He was alone, utterly and completely. Finally, he sagged, his shoulders slumping, his bravado crumbling like sand in the tide. The fight drained from him, leaving only a man caught in the web of his own greed. "Get him out," Greg growled, and two men escorted Charles to the door. His protests grew weaker with each step until the heavy doors shut behind him. The room exhaled as one. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter, the suffocating weight of fear lifted. Neighbors turned to me, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and awe. "Judge Reynolds," Mrs. Patel whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "You saved us." I shook my head gently. "No, you saved yourselves. I only gave you the courage to stand." The board members wasted no time in drafting a resolution, suspending Charles permanently and launching a full audit of the HOA's finances. Volunteers stepped forward, neighbors eager to rebuild what had been broken, to restore trust where corruption had taken root. And true to my word, the next morning I filed the complaint. Investigators swarmed the HOA office within days, seizing records, interviewing residents, piecing together the trail of fraud. Charles was indicted within the month. The trial was swift. I did not sit on the bench this time, of course, but in the gallery, watching as evidence after evidence was presented. The same binder I had built, the same voices that had once whispered in fear, now spoke boldly into the record. The jury took less than a day to convict him. When the gavel fell, sentencing him to years behind bars, the neighborhood erupted in relief. It wasn't just victory, it was liberation. Months passed, and Meadowbrook transformed. The roses bloomed freely again. Children's laughter returned to the streets. Greg raised the flag on his pole every morning without a single word of complaint. Mrs. Patel no longer worried about letters in her mailbox. The playground was repaired, the pool restored, the funds finally used for the community instead of a tyrant's greed. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the houses in gold, I sat on my porch once more. Neighbors waved as they walked by, smiles replacing the tension that had once hung heavy over this street. Peace had returned, fragile, but real. Greg wandered over, hands in his pockets. He stood beside me, gazing out at the quiet neighborhood. "You know, Reynolds," he said softly, "when you moved in, none of us thought you'd stick it out. Most people who stood up to Charles ended up moving away. But you beat him." I took a slow sip of coffee, the steam rising in the cool air. "It was never about beating him," I said. "It was about showing that justice still matters. That bullies only win when good people stay silent." Greg smiled, then chuckled. "Well, I'll tell you one thing. We couldn't have done it without you." I set my cup down, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the rooftops. "Maybe," I said. "But in the end, it wasn't me standing in that garage. It wasn't me risking retaliation for speaking up. It was all of you. And that's what makes this victory last." As night settled over Meadowbrook, the street lights flickered on, casting a gentle glow on the homes we had fought so hard to protect. The neighborhood was no longer Charles Whitman's kingdom. It was ours, free, united, and stronger than ever. And for the first time since I had moved here, I allowed myself to relax, knowing that justice had prevailed not because of who I was, but because of what we stood for together. The months following Charles Whitman's downfall unfolded like the slow healing of a deep wound. The neighborhood, once suffocated under the weight of his tyranny, began to breathe again. It wasn't an immediate transformation. Scars lingered, and trust, once shattered, took time to rebuild. But little by little, Meadowbrook shifted, its people reclaiming not just their homes, but their sense of community. I remember the first neighborhood meeting after Charles' removal. The community center, which had always felt heavy with intimidation and dread, now buzzed with cautious optimism. Instead of Charles' booming voice dictating every motion, residents took turns at the microphone, speaking openly, sometimes nervously, about what they wanted for their future. "We need transparency," one neighbor said. "No more secret meetings," added another. "And no more ridiculous fines," Mrs. Patel insisted, earning a round of applause. The new interim board nodded, taking careful notes, listening, truly listening, for the first time in years. That single meeting lasted well past midnight, but no one seemed to mind. People left not with fear gnawing at their stomachs, but with hope in their hearts. I watched from the back row, hands folded, a quiet observer. I had promised myself I would not interfere unless absolutely necessary. My role had been to shine a light on the truth, not to become a new figure of authority. The neighborhood didn't need another ruler. It needed to find its own balance. Still, neighbors often approached me afterward. Some came with gratitude, some with questions, some simply to share their stories. Mrs. Patel told me how, for the first time in years, she was sleeping soundly without waking in dread of a new letter from the HOA. Greg admitted that raising his flag each morning felt less like an act of defiance and more like a simple expression of pride. Even the children, once hushed whenever Charles drove by, now shouted and laughed freely in the streets, their games no longer interrupted by arbitrary rules. But rebuilding wasn't only about removing fear. It was about restoring trust. And that, perhaps, was the harder task. There were neighbors who still looked over their shoulders. wary that another Charles might rise in his place. Some still argued during meetings, their voices sharp with suspicion. After years of oppression, people had forgotten what it felt like to disagree without punishment. It would take time to remember that conflict could exist without tyranny. One evening, about 2 months after the trial, I was sitting on my porch when a young couple approached. They had just moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the history that clung to these streets. "Judge Reynolds?" the man asked, his voice uncertain. "Yes," I said, setting down my book. "We heard stories about what happened here, about you." He hesitated, then added softly, "Why did you do it? Why risk yourself?" The question gave me pause. I had been asked versions of it before, but each time it struck me differently. Why had I done it? I could have left, sold the house, moved on. I had no obligation to fight for these people, not legally, not personally. And yet, something had rooted me here, something beyond stubbornness. I looked at the young couple and said, "Because justice isn't about obligation. It's about choice. When you see wrong and have the means to confront it, you either step forward or you step aside and let darkness grow." I couldn't step aside, not this time. They nodded quietly, as though the answer was more than they expected, and walked away hand in hand. That night, I sat long after the street had emptied, reflecting on my own words. Retirement had left me searching for purpose, for something beyond the echo of gavels and the endless weight of verdicts. In some ways, Charles had unwittingly given me that purpose. He had reminded me why I had taken the bench all those years ago, not for power, not for recognition, but to protect the vulnerable, to ensure the law served the people, not the other way around. Weeks later, the HOA elected a new board. This time, the process was transparent, with ballots cast openly and counted in front of everyone. No intimidation, no manipulation. A mix of old and new faces took seats, including Mrs. Patel, who accepted her nomination reluctantly but with a fire in her eyes. "I may not know all the legal terms," she said at her swearing-in, "but I know what it feels like to be bullied, and I'll never let that happen here again." Her words were met with thunderous applause. The neighborhood changed in ways both big and small. The broken swings at the playground were replaced within weeks. The pool reopened by summer, filled with the laughter of families who hadn't enjoyed it in years. Even the landscaping improved, as neighbors volunteered weekends to plant flowers, trim hedges, and paint fences together. But perhaps the most profound change was less visible. It was in the way people carried themselves, heads higher, shoulders lighter. Fear had once been the invisible fence around Meadowbrook. Now it was gone, and with it came a renewed sense of ownership, not of property, but of community. As for Charles, his name faded slowly, like a stain scrubbed from memory. Some spoke of him bitterly, others with pity, but eventually he became less of a presence and more of a cautionary tale. His fall reminded everyone that power, unchecked, could corrupt even the simplest of places. I still receive letters sometimes, neighbors thanking me, or sharing updates long after I've stepped back from meetings. Some invite me to barbecues, others to birthdays, eager to fold me into the life of the community. And though I cherish their kindness, I often decline, choosing instead to remain the quiet guardian on the edge of the street, watching, listening, knowing that true strength comes when people no longer need saving. Yet there are moments when I allow myself to step into their joy. Like the evening of the 4th of July, when the sky cracked open with fireworks and Greg's flag rippled proudly in the night. Children darted with sparklers, parents laughed over plates of food, and neighbors who once avoided each other now shared stories like old friends. Greg found me that night, sitting at the edge of the lawn. "Come on, Reynolds," he said, clapping me on the back. "You've earned a burger at least." I smiled and joined them, letting the warmth of the crowd wash over me. For a moment, I wasn't the judge, or the man with the binder, or the symbol of justice. I was just a neighbor, part of something larger than myself. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Because in the end, the story wasn't about Charles Whitman, or even about me. It was about Meadowbrook, about a community that had been pushed to the brink of despair, only to rise stronger, united, and unafraid. It was about the power of ordinary people to confront extraordinary injustice when they chose to stand together. And it was about the simple truth that justice, once ignited, spreads like fire, burning away the shadows until only light remains. Now, when I sit on my porch at dusk, I no longer listen for the heavy tread of Charles' footsteps or the slam of his car door. Instead, I hear laughter drifting down the street, the creak of swings carrying children higher, the soft hum of peace settling over a place that once knew fear too well. And in that sound, I find my answer. I fought because it was right. I stayed because it was necessary. But I remained because, in the end, this wasn't just a neighborhood. It had become home.